Hello, we are going to be talking about the fantasy genre in this video. The way that I break down fantasy might be a little different than other people, but I think this way it makes it easier to compare and contrast with other genre like folktale and fairy tale. So for me, fantasy comes in two kinds: classic fantasy and contemporary fantasy, and we will talk about both of them in this slideshow. The definition of the fantasy genre has a few basic parts across both classic and contemporary, but the fantasy genre uses made up elements like magic, the supernatural, monsters, or alternative worlds. So this an alternative world would be like it seems like the real world, but then poof, there's magic. Or it seems like medieval Europe, but then poof, there's magic. So that would be considered an alternative world. As I said, in the way that we are going to think about fantasy, it can be classic or contemporary. And that just means classic as in like the older style of fantasy writing, or contemporary where it is set in a more modern, recognizable setting. And there are some very famous examples of both that we'll talk about. Fantasy stories go beyond the real world. Whether it's a classic or contemporary story, it can't happen in a realistic Earth or a realistic world that like the one that we live in. And they are similar to fairy tales, but this is where it's easy to make the distinction between a fantasy story and a fairy tale or folk tale, is that a fantasy story will have a named author. Right? They will have someone that has wholly created the universe that the story happens in. It might be based on a fairy tale or folk tale or legends or myths, but this is an original story, original characters to this named author. Some fairy tales do have authors connected with them, but they're often used the phrase retold by. So that author would have taken a hand-me-down fairy tale and just told it their way, which is a little bit different than a fantasy story. Okay, the setting of a fantasy story, it often gives it away or helps us understand that this is not the real world. This is a magical or supernatural or fantastic situation, hence the relationship between fantasy and fantastic. The first is the example of places. It has to happen maybe on a different planet or in a different universe. It can't necessarily be based on the same world that you and I live in. Another way to think about that is if the real world has gone wrong or gone strain, right? Suddenly there are dragons smashing through everything, or people are a supernatural creature and we don't know about them, and suddenly, boom, we've discovered werewolves actually exist. So that would be the kind of place where it's the real world gone wrong. It's a different planet or a different universe entirely. It is a different Earth, could as well might happen. Castles, forests, little villages, these are often the place where classic fantasy occurs. And we're going to stick with that for our definitions: castle, forest, little villages, because even in contemporary fantasy, we often find ourselves away from the urban world. Although there are some examples of people writing urban fantasy. The time, like I said, we've got it, the two types: classic, which would be distant past, or what we might think of as medieval times. We can tell that it was supposed to be a long time ago, but it might not be a specific time period, or since it's a different world entirely, it won't correlate or relate to a time that we share. And then there's contemporary, which is in a modern setting. So think about Harry Potter is that famous example of contemporary fantasy. The social expectations for fantasy, they really depend. So it depends on the author's choices. Is the author choosing to use the social skills and social expectations of a ancient Europe or an ancient culture of some kind? or is the social expectations and behaviors something like modern times? So it depends on the author's choices, the social aspects. This is where the authors can do a lot of world building with their expectations. They will create this world for you, and if they're doing their job right, you will be able to imagine it or understand it along with them. Okay. Fantasy will have two basic plot structures. There may be something really unique that someone comes up with, but for the most part, we can count on these two plot structures. One is the most likely the plot arc or plot mountain, the beginning, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. That typical construction that we are used to seeing. Or another really common plot structure for fantasy is the hero's journey. Now, some of you may have studied that in the past, and some of you, this might be all new to you. Don't worry about understanding the hero's journey quite yet, but in short, a hero's journey is where this person is living, they know nothing about what's going on, they're living their normal life, something extraordinary happens, they're invited on an adventure, they meet people that help them on this adventure, they go through the adventure, they face challenges and death, they overcome them, not without losses usually, and then they return to their normal world or to the new normal with a new sense of power and capability. So that that is their journey. So we're following one person or one character's journey through this. Those are the two plot structures. So we've got the plot arc, which we're pretty familiar with, and the hero's journey, which might be new to us. The most common events in a plot or in a fantasy plot is that most events could not happen in real life. Okay, so like you're going to have things that could seem like typical normal things, but then you're going to have a lot that could not happen. You don't have to go out and feed the dragon. You're not going to call magic and have a fire. You're not going to meet a singing, talking, sentient harp or any other animal that can talk to you. So the events that happen are outside of life. They're beyond extraordinary and into the supernatural, the beyond the natural world sort of things like magic and whatnot. Okay, and again, magic. If there's magic, it's fantasy. All right, we can have never mind. That's okay. There's fantasy does overlap with a lot of other genre, but just keep in mind magic is a key ingredient to the fantasy genre. So the next thing that we're going to be looking at are themes and conflict inside of fantasy. So common themes and conflict types. Fantasy is really easy. The common themes is related to the topic of good and versus evil. Okay, so if you can remember the theme topic as being good versus evil, the theme will be the message that comes from that. What does it mean to be good? What does it mean to defeat evil? Or how does evil begin? So the message the author is sending you is will surround these ideas of good and evil, maybe even bravery or courage, which same thing, but like I said, just think about it as a good guys versus the bad guys. That's a very common fantasy theme. Another common one is the coming of age. So they set a coming of age where a young person becomes an adult or starts on their journey to adulthood in a fantasy context. And usually they do this because some aspect of what they want us to look at, some part of what they want us to learn, they can only do if they use this really amazing setting. Or they just really like the setting and the coming of age will draw you in as a reader. So because the character is about your age, just think about Harry Potter, an 11-year-old, right? When you start out reading that book. The conflict that you'll come up with or see most often, and not always, you'll see other kinds, but these are the most common, is character versus character. So the hero versus the villain. Or character versus supernatural. So the character might have to battle a warlock or a dragon. So it's, a form of character versus character. Good versus evil. Okay, some examples of the fantasy genre would be a classic example would be basically anything by Tolkien. The Hobbit, which you might be familiar with, they made a movie recently, and The Lord of the Rings, which they made three very famous movies early in the 2000s, and the final one won an Oscar for Best Picture. So they take the classic literature, the classic fantasy, which is set in a world of wizards and elves and dwarves and men and dragons, and they spin a wonderful tale, or Tolkien spins a wonderful tale. He even writes complete languages for these characters to use in his fantasy. So he's the world building king, as they say. So you can't get much more classic fantasy than The Hobbit or the Lord of the Rings trilogy. There's 3 books in that trilogy. Modern example is, of course, Harry Potter. How could we forget Harry Potter? So that would be contemporary fantasy. Harry becomes a wizard, and we follow him on his journey through fantastical creatures and tiny little villages and good versus evil. A television or movie example that's contemporary is The Witcher. So The Witcher, it began as a story, a fantasy story. It became a video game. And then it became a television show, which is, I think is quite good. But that's just my 2 cents. Okay, so those are our examples. And some imagery that goes with our classic fantasy. So I want to make sure that we stick with our big picture fantasy so that it's easy to distinguish between fantasy and some of our other genres, is that you will have wizards and elves and dwarves and knights in shining armor frequently, and ladies in distress. And in really interesting fantasy, the lady will be in armor and the knight or the prince will be in distress, and dragons. And I'm sure I'm missing all kinds of other fantasy images and tropes. That's a commonly used device in it. So these are our classic fantasy big idea images.